Oops. By the way, Professor Aquino,
Yes.
I'm not sure if I received the flyer that you said you sent me.
I will send you, Professor. No, don't worry. I will send
Right.
you the flyer. I guess we receive it. Anyway, I will show it. I will show it in the.
Yes, thank you.
Mhm.
I didn't get any attachments on that particular mail that you sent me, so
Yeah, I see. I see.
I would appreciate it if you could send it again.
Yes, yes, I will. Professor, if you don't mind, we can begin now. We are ready.
Okay.
Okay, just allow me a minute to introduce you and we can begin. Okay. Uh, Good morning, everybody. This is Carlos Aquino speaking. I am the coordinator of the Center for Asian Studies of San Marcos National University. In this opportunity, I am very pleased and honored to have Professor Akio Takahara, who will give a talk about China-Japan relation, present state and perspectives. Before this, and I will present a brief curriculum vitae of Professor Akio Takahara. Professor Akio Takahara, he's a lawyer. He graduated from Tokyo University, and he did his master and doctors. He got his master and doctor degree from University of Sussex. He has a long career in several places. I will just resume. He was a program officer in the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in the year 1988, 1989. He was a visiting researcher in the Consulate General of Japan in Hong Kong, 1989 to 1991. He was also an assistant professor and associate professor in School of International Studies Oberlin University. He was also associate professor in the and later professor in the Faculty of Law and Politics in Rikyo University. Also, he has been yes, I'm reading some of his posts that he has had. He was also a visiting scholar in the Embassy of Japan in the People's Republic of China. More recently, he has been, for example, visiting scholar in the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research in Harvard University. He has been a policy advisor to the Japanese Coast Guard. He has been a member of the and Secretary General of the New Japan-China Friendship 21st Century Committee. He has been, he was the Distinguished Research Fellow of the Japan Forum on International Relations. He was a Vice Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo. He was a Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy in the University of Tokyo. No? And now he's Professor of Contemporary Chinese Politics at the Graduate School of Law and Politics at the University of Tokyo. So we're very pleased to have him there. Before that, Professor, let me tell you that we are pleased also to have among the assistant in our Zoom room, Ambassador Victor Hugo Morales, Ambassador of Mexico in Peru, Ambassador Jorge Abarca del Campio, also a very distinguished professor, specialist in Asia, like Professor Renato Valderrama from Mexico, like Professor Ignacio Villagrán from Argentina, very good friends also. Okay, Professor Takahara, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Aquino, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me. I'm very excited that I can be connected to Peru, a country which I have never visited yet, but I do hope that in the future I'll have chances to visit Lima and Machu Picchu and all those famous places that are very well known in Japan too. And my friend, Mr. Kazuyuki Katayama has just been appointed our ambassador to Peru. And as you may already know, he's a great China expert himself. So um, he sent me an email recently that unfortunately he cannot join us this morning, but he looks forward to my visit to Lima while he is in office in Peru. So well, without further ado, we don't have a lot of time, and there's such amount of things that I would like to talk about Japan-China relations. So let me just dive into my presentation, which is on Japan-China Relations, Present State and Perspectives. And some of you may know, it was just today in Japan that the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi flew in to Tokyo, and this photo was taken several hours ago. Mr. Motegi, the Japanese Foreign Minister, and Mr. Wan held a joint press conference only a few hours before. And when Mr. Wan Yi went into the Japanese Foreign Ministry, the office building, he was accosted by a press person. Um, what do you expect out of this meeting? And he answered, Mr. Wang Yi answered, well, I came for enhancing cooperation. I came for enhancing communication. And those were the words just before they started talking. So the atmosphere was very cordial, apparently, and they talked a lot about the need for cooperation and good things. But of course, on certain issues, they could not agree. For example, as you may know, the Japanese and the Chinese have been in very deep disagreement over what we call the Senkaku Islands, and the Chinese call the Diaoyu Dao. So Motegi, after the meeting, when they held the joint press conference, explained that, well, I explained Japan's position to Mr. Wan and strongly urged China's positive action. To which Mr. Wan answered by saying, we will defend our sovereignty. There's no doubt about that. And Japan should avoid actions that complicate the situation in delicate maritime areas. So those words had to be said, but overall, it was rather clear that Wang Yi chose to fly to Tokyo. You know, he didn't have to do that. He could have talked online like we are doing now, but he wanted to show his willingness to improve relations with Japan. And as far as the Senkakus are concerned, both sides agreed this time to open a hotline on the maritime and air communication mechanism. We have had this mechanism for a couple of years, but on top of that, both sides agreed that we should have a hotline about that open by the end of the year. So it was a positive visit so far. Tomorrow, Wan Yi will meet our new Prime Minister, Mr. Suga. But just to tell you more about the present situation and the prospects, let me just quickly go through the very turbulent 10 years that we have experienced with China from 2010. It started 10 years ago when the Chinese trawler rammed into the Japanese patrol boats, the Japanese Coast Guard boats. For some of you who are not familiar with the situation, this is Japan here, okay, and the Senkakus are here. And since 1895, the Japanese have had the Senkakus as part of our territory. And the Chinese side, be it the Qing dynasty or the Republican days or the Republic of China or the People's Republic of China that was established in 1949, there was no protest whatsoever. And it was only in 1971 that first Taiwan claimed sovereignty in the spring. And at the end of that year, in 1971, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, for the first time claims sovereignty. And at that time, the main reason was oil. There were research reports saying that at the seabed around the Senkakus, there could be a lot of oil. And that was one of the biggest reasons why these two governments claim sovereignty for the first time in almost how many years? Over 70 years. So that's the situation. It's a long story, so if you have any questions later, I can answer. But anyhow, when the trawler collided with the Japanese Coast Guard vessels, the Chinese side published this one. This is the picture, the drawing that Xinhua News Agency sent out one day after the collision. You can see big Japanese patrol boats ramming into the belly of a small Chinese trawler, not only once, but twice. So this is the version that the Chinese public got. But on the other hand, the Japanese side, of course, has a different version, and you can still watch this YouTube. It's uploaded, so it's worth watching once if you haven't seen it before. But this is the Japanese version. It was leaked by a member of the Japanese Coast Guard who actually took this, and the Japanese policy at that time was not to release it for some reason, but this guy in the Coast Guard decided that he should leak the video, and there it is. So you can see that it was actually the trawler that rammed into the backside of the Japanese Coast Guards. And it's very interesting that the fishing boat did not get any damage. The damage was only made on the part of the two Japanese bigger Coast Guard vessels. And the captain was arrested. And you know the story. The Chinese exerted a lot of pressure. At the end, they arrested four Japanese nationals in China who were working in China. And finally, the Japanese side relented and did not prosecute the captain and released him. So that's what happened in 2010. But 2 years later, when the Japanese central government decided to purchase some of the islands that used to be owned by a private landlord in order to prevent the then Tokyo governor by the name of Mr. Ishihara, who was angry about his perception that the Japanese central government was not doing enough to defend the islands. So this Tokyo governor suddenly started to say that the Tokyo metropolitan government, will purchase these islands from this private landlord, and we will send some members of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and defend the islands. And those kinds of things were said by this guy. And the prime minister, the democratic government then was in deep trouble because it was quite clear that that should provoke the Chinese side very deeply. And it was not possible to predict what the Chinese side will do in reaction to those actions that Ishihara said he would take. And therefore, the final decision on the central government's part, was to purchase the islands instead of Ishihara by paying a higher price. But to this, the Chinese side reacted very violently. And one aspect of the violence was that they didn't stop the public run wild, and they did a lot of damage to Japanese car dealers, to Japanese supermarkets and factories. And these are some of the photos that were taken at that time. So this is what happened in 2012, and the relationship fell to the bottom, as it were, ever since they established diplomatic relations 40 years before, in 1972. However, after that, things got better bit by bit. The first meeting between Prime Minister Abe and the President Xi Jinping, who both came to power towards the end of 2012, was 2 years after they became Prime Minister and President. That was November 2014, on the sidelines of the APEC meeting that was held in Beijing that year. But you can see that in this photo at the very left, there are no smiles on these two. But gradually they start smiling. And in May 2018, this is a picture when Prime Minister Li Keqiang officially visited Japan. So you can see the gradual improvement in the relationship. And it peaked when Abe himself made an official visit to China in October 2018. It's already 2 years before, but we see a lot of Japanese flags flying in Beijing, and we hadn't seen that for many, many years. And 2019, June, Abe visited China again for the trilateral meeting between Japan, China, and South Korea. and sorry, that was December 2019. But before that, in June, it was Xi Jinping who came to Japan to attend the G20 meeting that was held in Osaka. And Abe gave a special treatment to Xi Jinping by hosting a dinner, especially for him. You know, there were 20 heads of government that gathered in Osaka at that time, but it was only to Xi Jinping that Abe gave that privilege of this dinner with Xi Jinping. So you can see how the relationship warmed up in 2018 and 2019, and it was decided that Xi Jinping will make a state visit in 2020 in April. So it was a preparation period for that big visit. However, because of the coronavirus, Xi Jinping's state visit was postponed. And in 2020, that's this year, we have seen an increase in the number of Chinese Coast Guard vessels coming to the area around the Senkaku Islands. I can show you a graph later on how much they have increased. And also this issue, as you know, the Hong Kong protest movement, the crushing of it by force, and the issues about the so-called forced re-education of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. All these things have, of course, played out negatively in Japan-China relations. And now the atmosphere is quite bad as far as the public is concerned. But still the governments are in good terms. Therefore, the visit by Wang Yi to Japan. China is very serious in maintaining and developing the relationship with Japan. How do we analyze this? My basic, simple analytical framework is like this. There are many, many factors that play a role in Japan-China relations, but I roughly categorize them into 4 areas. One is domestic politics. Yes, certainly domestic politics is an important factor in diplomacy, as we all know. Economic interests, of course, between Japan and China, economics are so important. And the third area is the international environment, especially the America factor is big in this part of the world. And also security issues closely related because of the alliance that Japan has with the US. And the fourth area is people's perceptions and people's emotions and people's identity, as it were, you know, how they perceive themselves, how we perceive ourselves in this part of the world. All these are very important, and I shall explain briefly one by one from domestic politics. You know, in China, China's relations with Japan has always been a very delicate political issue because for any Chinese political leader, he or she cannot be seen as weak-kneed, especially towards Japan because of the historical baggage that they carry. And therefore, if a leader wants to extend a friendly hand towards Japan, he has to consolidate his power base so that he doesn't have to worry about the internal criticisms against his being friendly towards the Japanese side. And we all know that Xi Jinping has been successful in consolidating his power base. So this very important, necessary condition for a friendly Japan policy is cleared. What about on the Japanese side? On the Japanese side, I'll show you in a minute, but the Japanese public's perception towards China is very bad. The image of China has gone down so much because of the actions that the Chinese side has been taking in recent years. So the emotions are rather negative. But at the same time, interestingly, the Japanese public understands the importance of our relations with China. And therefore, the Japanese politicians must attend to both of these things. One is people's negative emotions. So the leader has to stand firm against Chinese actions around the Senkakus, for instance. But at the same time, he has to really try to improve relations with China because that's what the public wants by reason. They understand and they vote according to the reason. They support the leaders that try and succeed in the stabilization and promotion of relations with China. This is a very interesting and important point that foreign media often does not see. The second factor area is international environment. And the Chinese side has a diplomatic traditional pattern, as it were, that whenever China has a difficult relations with the US, they turn to Japan. You know, the relationship with the US is very important for China. Many Chinese friends tell me that a stable China-US relations is the basis for the stability of everything in China. You know, up to this year, I didn't quite understand what they were saying when they said that a stable China-US relations is the basis of the stability for everything in China. But now I can understand that, you know, it affects the stability in the Chinese economy. Then it affects the stability in Chinese society, and that certainly impacts the politics of in China. So quite clearly now that U.S.-China relations worsening very badly, there is a strong need for China to improve relations with Japan, not only for the stability of their international relations, but they expect that Japan will be a source for more technology, for more investments. So economics is also very important, which is the next area that I would like to turn to. Um, Japan's trade with China and US, this is not quite easy to see. So let me just turn to the next one. This is easier to understand. Trade of Japan's from April to September, the 6 months in 2020, this is in million yen. You can see from this table very clearly that China is outstandingly the largest trading partner of ours in Japan. And because of the coronavirus, the new coronavirus, trade has gone down so much with many areas. But when it comes to the trade with China, it's positive. So China is the only country where with which the export uh, has been increasing. And as far as import is concerned, it's still in the minus, but it's going to be positive, I think, by the end of the year. So that's the situation in Japan. What about in China? In China, their largest trading partner this year is ASEAN, when we add the export and import together. And then comes EU, but still, as a single country, the USA is their largest trading partner country. And Japan still is the second largest trading partner country from the viewpoint of China. And not only that, not only the quantity of trade, but also the quality of it matters for China. You know, when the trawler collision incident happened in 2010, actually one of the measures that the Chinese took was to impose economic sanctions. They deliberately slowed down the treatment of Japanese goods at the customs, and they stopped the export of rare earth. Those kinds of things were done. But then in 2012, when the Japanese government purchased the islands, they did not exert they did not impose any economic sanctions on Japan. Why? Because they learned from their experience 2 years back that if you do that, it's going to hurt yourself too. They understood that what's important in China's trade relations with Japan is not the quantity, but rather the quality. That is, key components, key parts imported from Japan to produce the sophisticated machinery and other things that the Chinese manufacturers were producing. And also, investments are very important for China. Um, Especially in the northeast of part of China, in the region that are not doing well economically. big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Canton, all those places, they're okay because other countries go in. But as far as the other poorer areas are concerned, they really like the Japanese investments that come in. They pay tax properly. They don't run away. They do their best to stay and make business well, and therefore, and of course, that contributes to the employment, which is a very important societal and social and political issue now in China. So for all those reasons, they understood the importance of the economic exchange relationship that they have with Japan. And as you know, the Chinese economic downturn, the slowdown is real, and we also all know that the Chinese are sort of recovering from the coronavirus shock much more quickly than other countries, other big nations. However, when we compare the state of the Chinese economy now and a year before or 2 years before, it's quite clear how much damage has been done by the coronavirus to the Chinese economy. And even before that, 2 years ago, last year, because of the economic slowdown, the Chinese leaders had a very dark prospect of the future of their growth. And then came the serious conflict with the United States, or the sanctions, and then came the coronavirus, and then came the serious flooding in the southern part of China. All these things are hurting the Chinese. And since the Chinese leaders know that, they were desperate to stop the spread of the coronavirus, and they succeeded, and they are doing their best to lift the economy up again. And so that effort is really remarkable. But have they done enough to reach the stage of last year's or 2 years back? That's not done. So we still have to be very careful about the state of the Chinese economy. And they know that. So they would like to consolidate their relationship with Japan on the economic front. But the fourth area of people's perceptions, this is fascinating because it's such a contrast. You can see that on the Chinese side, look at the green line. The green line indicates the percentage of Chinese people who have a positive image of Japan. And ever since, the 2012 purchase of the islands by the Japanese government, and Chinese side's image of Japan went down. That was reflected in the survey that was conducted the following year. But ever since 2013, the image is getting better and better and better, right? Except for this year, it slightly came down, but uh, the percentage is still rather high. And I'm going to explain to you why there hasn't been another increase this year. But before I turn to that, this is the percentage, very high percentage of the Japanese people who have a negative image of China. This year, it almost reached 90%. And only 10% of the Japanese had a good image. Why is that? Why is this the case? Whenever I show this to the Chinese people, they're shocked because they know that their image of Japan is getting better, but they didn't know. Usually they don't know that the Japanese image of China is so bad. And for the Japanese, the reasons are very clear, because you send your vessels to the Senkakus. Okay, so this is the graph that shows the records of intrusions of the Chinese government and other vessels, well, mainly Chinese government vessels, into the Japanese territorial waters. They didn't do this before. It was only in 2008 for the first time that two of the patrol boats of the Chinese Coast Guards entered the territorial waters around the Senkakus. And it was only after 2010 and 2012, all these incidents happened. The Chinese seized that opportunity and suddenly increased the number of their patrol boats to come into the territorial waters around the Senkakus, exert pressure on Japan, trying to change the status quo by physical force. That's what they've been trying to do. And as you can see, the red shows the number of vessels that come into the territorial sea, the 12 nautical mile zone. But the blue line shows the number of those, excuse me, those number of vessels that come into the contiguous zone just outside the territorial waters. And you can see the great increase, excuse me, since last year. So the Japanese don't like that. This is sorry, this is the graph that shows the figure that shows the increase in the Chinese visitors to Japan. And you can see that in 2014, it was below 2.5 million. But in 2019, last year, it was approaching 10 million. So 4 times increase in 5 years, which is quite excuse me, quite remarkable. And this year, of course, because of the coronavirus, this number is almost close to zero. So that explains why, that partly explains why the percentage of the Chinese with the good image of Japan did not go up this year. We think that the number of tourists that come to Japan has a close relationship with the changing the percentage of good perceptions about Japan, because when the Chinese come to Japan, they realize that what they were taught about Japan in China is different from the real Japan. And they send a lot of SNS messages to their friends, their relatives, their families, and become repeaters to come and travel to Japan. So unfortunately, because of the coronavirus, there was no increase of tourists this year. I mean, tourists were zero, so no new flow, as it were, of new coming tourists. We only had to rely on the stock of those who had already come. And that explains partly why there was no increase in the percentage of people who with a good image of Japan. That's our explanation, our interpretation. So finally, what do we need for a stable relationship? I think it's important that there are two aspects in Japan-China relations. Yes, one is the resilient side. If there was no resilience, it was not possible to improve the relationship in a short period of time, like as you have seen. So what's the elements that constructs the resilience? It's the economic exchange, it's the cultural affinity, and cooperation in non-traditional security issues like anti-piracy of the coast of Eden, COVID, anti-COVID, anti-drug trafficking, all those things are going on. So those are very important elements that constitute resilience. But at the same time, of course, there is the fragile aspect in the relationship, security issues, islands issues, history issues, and there's a huge perception gap, as I showed you, based largely on information gap. The information that the Chinese side get and the Japanese side get about Japan-China relations are very different. And that's a very serious problem, I think, in the relationship. So what are we going to do if we wanted to maintain peace and co-prosper? I think we have to mobilize all sorts of things that we can lay our hands on. For example, the realists would argue that balance of power is important to maintain peace. I think there's truth in that. So Quad, the development of our alliance networks. I think that's important. Not only the four countries, Japan, US, Australia, and India, but other countries who would like to join forces, I think they are welcome. But at the same time, we need cooperation and further interdependence, which the liberalists would argue that are main important conditions for peace. So we just signed RCEP, the Economic Partnership in the region. And COVID-19, like today, Mr. Motegi and Mr. Wang Yi, they discussed how we will cooperate to overcome the COVID-19 thing. Anti-piracy, I've already mentioned that. All those things need to be promoted. And at the same time, the constructivists would argue that we need common values, common norms. I think that's also important in maintaining peace. And we can do that. The Chinese will not object to rule of law, although the interpretation could be different. But when it comes to, for example, trade regulations, investments, regulations, and even maritime, not totally, but a good part of rule of law on the maritime scene, I think we can discuss and share. So on top of this, I would argue that fixing perception gaps, fixing information gaps, these are very important too. So I would say that we need to adopt a two-pronged approach. Competition is unavoidable because they are trying to change the status quo by physical force. What can we do? We can not say, all right, please take the senkakus. No, there's no question about that. So competition is necessary on the one hand, but on the other, we have to cooperate with China. So the question is, how well can we balance these two prongs? So finally, I'm sorry, I'm talking for too long, but this is the final part. I want to touch on the free and open Indo-Pacific, which was first proposed by former Prime Minister Abe at the TICAD meeting, the Tokyo International Conference for African Development, when it was held in Nairobi in Kenya in 2016. He very clearly stated this concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And if you go to the homepage of the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you will find these words. FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific, is something that would improve the connectivity between Asia and Africa through the free and open Indo-Pacific and promote the stability, prosperity, the region as a whole, and the key areas are developing an environment for international peace, stability, prosperity, sharing universal values, addressing global issues, together with developing countries, contributing to economic diplomacy, regional revitalization. All these good things are said. So you can see that what the Japanese are trying to emphasize is cooperation. We need more economic cooperation in the area, and it's not exclusive, it's an inclusive thing. But we should not forget that there is also the security side of things. So the competition side is certainly there. So it is a two-pronged thing. You know, on the one side there is competition, and on the other there is cooperation, and that's exactly the same as the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI has also two aspects: the strategic side and the economic side, right? I would say that the concept of the Belt and Road Initiative, this idea about the Silk Roads in the 21st century, is a product of the Chinese diplomatic and political genius. They're so good at inventing these concepts. And I would call it an attractive constellation. I deliberately used bright yellow so that you can't see it clearly, but the word here written is constellation. You know, just like reform and opening is also, in my definition, is a constellation, because they are not really tangible. It's very difficult to define and define the contour of the Belt and Road Initiative or the reform and opening for that matter. So my definition of the BRI is it is a signature project of Xi Jinping and the symbol of Xi Jinping's power and authority in the world, just as reform and opening was the symbol of Deng Xiaoping's power and authority. But what's important are the concrete projects in the BRI and the concrete policies in the reform and opening, right? They are tangible, they are real, so they are the stars, as it were. So we should focus on the stars and not on the constellation. We shouldn't talk too much about the constellation. It's not necessary. The Chinese will do those projects anyway because they want resources, they want markets, they want political influence. So for those things, the Chinese will keep on investing outside of China. And Xi Jinping just made us look up at the sky. He points at the sky, points at all the projects and says, look up, you can see a dragon there. That's the Belt and Road. And we go, wow, because we see glittering renminbi at the same time. So I would say FOIP, the free and open Indo-Pacific, is also a constellation. The same with the BRI, have both the strategic and economic aspects. So if we focused on the economic aspect of these two initiatives, we can cooperate. They can coexist. Because if we do a project together, if we do one star together, the Chinese can say it's part of the BRI constellation. We can say it's part of the FOIP constellation and are perfectly compatible. In Japan, many people still don't understand that FOIP has these two aspects. And because the atmosphere, the social atmosphere against China is rather bad, whenever the word FOIP is mentioned, people think about encirclement, containment, anti-China, all those things. But that's not correct. There are two aspects, and the Japanese government is, of course, fully aware of these two aspects. And if Xi Jinping can visit Japan perhaps next year or the following year, we would like him to say that China can cooperate with the Japanese version of FOIP. All right, so I don't think it's necessary to cover this final page, but if I may, basic point is that China is not monolithic. Don't let us not forget that. The views are divided there. There are hardliners, there's no question about that, who emphasize competition, but there are moderates who would emphasize the cooperative side of things. And so if we exert too much pressure on China, it will only help the hardliners. It would marginalize the moderates in China. So we should be aware of that. And we need the resolve, the wisdom, and the resilience to compete and cooperate with China at the same time. It's not easy, but we can do it. Let's not forget that from seeing things from the Chinese side also understands that they have to compete and cooperate with us at the same time. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. And now, any criticisms and questions are welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Takahara. Very interesting conference. You said that the framework and the development of the Japan-China relations, and that's very interesting. Yeah, I will give you just a small comment, and then we can open the floor to a question that have already been posted in the Zoom chat. Yeah, it's very interesting. Japan, China are the biggest countries, the second and third biggest economic power in the world, and the Asia Pacific that is becoming the center of the world economic activity, and also the more, these are the two important things. In the last 40, 30 years until from the Second World War, the region have been developing very fast under the Pax America that also benefited China, but things have changed because China is a bigger country now. They are more assertive now, and we can see that in the action in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. So within this situation, many people see what is going now as a kind of strategic competition between China and United States. And of course, Japan is, as you rightly said, Professor, is a friend of United States. They have many things in common. So now things are changing really, because in two sides, because in one side, China is becoming more assertive because of their biggest economic power. And also, at least in the Trump administration, it seems that the United States wanted to withdraw from the Asia Pacific. Really. So perhaps this thing of United States leaving the Asia Pacific even gave China more impetus to strengthen their position. But anyway, there is a changing government in the United States now. Many people saying, and that is a question that I want to also to make you, the Biden administration probably will retake that situation of the policy under Obama administration pivot to Asia, really. And for example, one question in particular, now that last week have been signing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that many people see as China becoming more strong in the Asia Pacific, and even we have seen that in the APEC summit, the President Xi Jinping said that China will even consider joining the TPP. Really. So question is United States going to join the TPP? Because we always remember, for example, this was a very big point of the strategy of pivot wage. I remember Ashton Carter, former Secretary of Defense, United States and the administration, saying that having the DPP is like having another aircraft carrier in the Asia Pacific. Really. So it was very a good point on that. So one question for you, Professor, is how is going to change under Biden administration United States policy? And the second thing, just to finish, is China and United States, they all, both of these countries have a common interest in the development of the Asia Pacific, that's it without doubt. But they have a conflict interest in that. You rightly said one of the questions, and also always I talk with the Chinese, Japanese on that. Yeah, it's very interesting. When Chinese go to Japan, they find a different situation in where they told in their country. For example, something that struck me, remember always when the surrender of Japan in 1945, Chinese always celebrate that. They always celebrate in the Second World War, Japan was defeated, and this year was the 75th anniversary. That's always, they celebrated a lot. But this year, they were not celebrated. Instead of that, they emphasized the China entrance in the Korean War. Really? Yeah, because as you rightly said, when China have trouble in the United States, they try to be closer to Japan. Really. So yeah, this is a very interesting phenomenon to understand, to really grasp what's going on in the Asia Pacific. Okay, we have a question, we have a very distinguished professor also here. So I will read, Professor, some questions that have been posted already for you, okay? Okay, let me see. Okay, there are several questions. Okay, you can also read, Professor, but I will also read for the sake of everybody, okay? Well, the first question is, yeah, something related about China-Japan relation. They said, why not Japan recognize the crimes against people of Nanking perpetrated by Japanese troops? Anyway, I think they have already done. Anyway, you can answer that, Professor.
It's okay,
Also,
sure.
yeah.
Should I start from that?
Yeah, please, Professor.
I don't think the Japanese government denies that there was a massacre. I think what we have not, that we cannot agree with the Chinese government is the number. They insist that there were 300,000 people that were massacred at that time. But the Japanese historians, many of them cannot agree with that. They could not have been so many people living in Nanjing at that time anyway. So the essential part, that is whether there was a massacre or not, that's not questioned. So please don't misunderstand. Also, there's been a lot of what's the word? Fake news in China that the Japanese side has never apologized about the war and things like that. But that's not true. It was quite impressive when the former Prime Minister, Mr. Wen Jiabao, came to Japan in 2007, gave a speech at the Diet, our parliament, and he squarely acknowledged, that the Japanese government, the Japanese leaders have repeatedly acknowledged that the war was an aggression and apologized for that. And this, the Chinese people and the Chinese government do appreciate it. That's the way he put it. And I was very moved because for reconciliation, the necessary condition and the sufficient conditions both have to be met. The necessary condition is for the aggressor to acknowledge the aggression and apologize. But that's not enough, is it? For reconciliation, the victim side must accept the apology. And it was the first time that a Chinese political leader did that in such a clear way. But unfortunately, there has been no Chinese leader that has followed suit.
Same, Professor. What you say is very interesting. I remember, I'm sure you have read, Professor Esla Boger have read a book about China and Japan relation facing history. And he said in one page, it's very interesting, China-Japan relationship. And he said, perhaps something that is lacking is that Chinese recognize and Japanese recognize this fact. In fact, they have recognized, but he said, perhaps some Japanese, not all, need more to apologize for the bad thing they did to China, but the Chinese need to thanks to Japan for all the good things, especially from the economic reform. I am struck. Many people think that Deng Xiaoping began this policy of open economic reform after visiting the United States, but in fact, he visited before Japan. Okay, in October 1978, he went to Japan. He went to Singapore. He was so surprised. Japan was so developed in front of China, and Japan give a lot of cooperation, give a lot of money to China. So I think Professor Isabel is very right to say, especially China have to recognize the contribution that Japan did to the recent economic development of China. Yeah, okay. I will read Professor Renato Valderrama from Mexico. He asks to you, what Japanese leaders have been discussing regarding its entrance to the RCEP? What does Japan will win? How this action affect relation with United States? How is the perception of Japanese people after Japan entrance to the RCEP?
Right. I think a lot of the European and North American media have got it wrong about RCEP because they kept on writing that it was China that was leading the RCEP negotiations, which is not true. They were not the most active, positive side, but rather Japan has always been very positive about it because it's quite clear. Of course, Japan has its own agricultural sector, which tends to be rather protectionist. But now, the Japanese agriculture is very different from, let's say, 30 years ago. Um, Except for a few items like rice and sugar, and there's only a few that are thought to be exceptional areas. Otherwise, now Japanese agriculture is open, and the farmers are ready for competition. They would rather export their products, and for exporting products, um, liberalization is good. So, and considering the strength of the Japanese manufacturing products, the great majority of the Japanese business circle have always wanted free trade with the region, with China even. And therefore, the Japanese way of procedure was that we will get the TPP done first, because the TPP is a higher level free trade arrangement. And after TPP, we'll do the RCEP, because we will then be in a better negotiating position to get better conditions for RCEP in the region. So, for Japan, time was ripe. We are a country that believe in multilateralism, that believe in free trade because of the manufacturing industries that we have. the mainstay of our economics, and therefore it's not quite true that China has been pushing for it. But now China, as I said, inside China there are different views. So the economists, the rational people understand the need for reform, and to implement reform, like Japan in the past, it's better to have this external pressure, what we call the gaiatsu. With the gaiatsu, it's easier for the internal domestic reformers to push for reform. And the Chinese understand this. So joining RCEP is good to promote reform, but still there are a lot of forces inside China that are not positive about reform. And that is a very interesting point that we find in the negotiation between China and the US. If you remember last year, they almost signed this 150 page agreement that touched on the state-owned enterprises, the subsidies issue. But then the Chinese suddenly changed face and decided not to sign the document, right? And that sort of reflected the conflicting forces within China, the reformers who want to use this gaiatsu to push forward the reform of the Chinese economic system, and those with the vested interests in the existence, the dominance, the oligopoly of the state-owned enterprises in China. So we welcome China to join TPP, but the hurdle is very high. So we don't think that they can actually do it very soon. And if Xi Jinping really, really wants to join the TPP, he has to implement further reforms. And that's not going to be easy politically, even for him.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Professor. Yeah, in fact, the RCP, as you rightly said, was not promoted first by China. It was promoted by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Already, they have a bilateral FTA with Japan, China, Korea, but they want to make it more institutionalized. But one question on that, Professor. For example, India was supposed to join it, and many people expect, I guess Japan also expect the India to join it because, in a sense, China is very big, really. So, in a sense, India, another big country, will balance China present, but China at the end didn't go it. So what is the expectation for India joining in the near future? Are you positive on that, Professor?
I don't think India will agree to join. I don't think the US, sorry, I forgot to answer that question. I don't think the Biden administration will join TPP soon because of domestic opposition. In the United States, as in India, there are sectors who object to the idea of free trade. And particularly in Congress, in Washington, I don't think the Biden administration will be able to persuade all those members of Congress who are um, addressing the voices within their constituencies against free trade. And certainly India is in a similar position. Of course, we would like to have India join because of its huge, huge market potential. And yes, its weight in negotiations. But at the same time, we all know how troublesome India can be. So I don't really mind. I mean, I think we can do without India for some time, and if later they change their mind, they can come.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, another question, Professor Ignacio Diagram. He said, thank you so much for your excellent presentation, Professor Takahara. You mentioned that China-Japan relation improved when United States-China relations deteriorate. And I guess this is a low point now, I guess, for China and Japan relations. So I wanted to ask whether there was any comment about last month quadrilateral security dialogue operation from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in his recent visit to Japan.
We don't know yet because the meeting only ended a few hours ago. I'm also interested in this point, but my guess is, he already mentioned when he was in Malaysia, I think a couple of weeks ago, or even a little earlier than that. But he said that what was his expression? The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy that was proposed by the U.S. He doesn't agree with that, and he thinks the quadrilateral arrangements on the security front looks as if it is going to form an Asian version of NATO, and that is old Cold War type thinking. So he objects that. So it's very interesting that Wang Yi and obviously Xi Jinping understands the distinction between the Japanese version of the FOIP vision and the American version of the FOIP strategy, you know, and he only objects to the strategic part of FOIP and deliberately does not mention the Japanese version. So please take note of that. And next time when Wang Yi says something about FOIP, it's interesting to observe which part of FOIP he's talking about. And you will find the distinction too. And the Chinese side have now completely got it. The Japanese have told them very clear, not very clearly, but in a very subtle way. And the Chinese have got our message. You know, we don't deny that in FOIP, as I mentioned, there are two aspects. So the competition is certainly there, but the Japanese side is telling the Chinese, it's not only that, there is the cooperative side. And why has the Japanese been able to propose these two-pronged ideas? Because we have had to deal with China in this way for many years now. You know, it's not our choice. We have been pushed to adopt this two-pronged approach vis-a-vis China for the past several years, especially since 2010. You know, there's no doubt there's a lot of competition on the maritime front, and we feel very tense about that. But at the same time, we cooperate with China. Now, many Japanese companies are still investing big in China, and we cooperate with them over COVID, over anti-piracy, as I mentioned. So this is the fact in life, you know. So we have to be good at balancing these two aspects. And this is what we are trying to tell the Americans now. You know, you have to do the same, because if you only lay emphasis on competition, other countries won't follow you. And the Americans are beginning to understand this point. So under the Biden administration, I am sure the strategic competition will continue, but there will be some tactical changes. And Biden would emphasize more on the cooperation side of things, but the competition will go on.
Yes. One more question, Professor. Yeah. This is, my question is, well, I guess you have said that, but anyway, perhaps you can summarize. What are the challenges that Japan and China will have to face in bilateral relation? And because it is a short one, I will read also the following question. One. This is again from Professor Ignacio Vieira. It is a very helpful distinction to think about this free of navigation in the Pacific from the China foreign policy perspective. I shall look into 1G declaration in Malaysia. Anyway, yeah, yes, I want to add something, Professor. The Asia Pacific is a very interesting scenario. Really, China, Japan have been neighbors all the long history, but United States is a very recent actor, okay, from the Second World War, even if they have the president of Filipinas after they got it from Spain, after they won Spanish, the war with the Spanish. But the question is, as Chinese said, we have been all here. United States is just recently came. So yeah, Chinese say when there is a problem, let's solve our problem among ourselves. Not third parties should get involved, referring to the United States, okay? So, and also another question is, perhaps Chinese think United States it is here, but probably they will need state in 20, 30 years. But looking from countries in Asia, from Japan, Korea, the question is, especially for the smallest one of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, there's very small country compared to China. There is a very asymmetry between. So some people said, even not openly, but I guess Singapore Prime Minister have said that we need United States presence because China is too big for us. So yeah, this is a very interesting thing, really. So the question is, United States is going to be there always because the Chinese are betting on that. United States probably in the next 20, 30 years, they will get tired. They will not have the economic might to pay for a military presence there. So this is a very interesting. So I want to finish that, Professor. Yes, trying to answer this question. What is going the challenge of China relation from now on?
You know, one interesting question, even in Japan-China relations, is the future of the US, as you mentioned. And as a China expert, when I compare the future prospects of China and the US, I tend to think that the prospects of the US future is much brighter than that of China's future prospects. Because think of it, you know, China has so many serious issues, one of which is the aging of society, which is already very serious, but in the future, increasingly, there'll be a lot of tragedies happening in those families, not only in the countryside, but also in the urban areas too. And if the government wants to stabilize society, wants a stable society, they'll have to put in a lot of resources. And where would that resources come from? You know, also environmental degradation, the huge income gap. Well, income gap exists in the US too, but when we think about the rich nature that the US has, you know, the resources with all the shale oil and everything, and the freedom, which that's important because in China in the future, no serious Chinese will think that the current political system will go on forever. So one day there'll be a big fundamental change in the system, and not so many Chinese are optimistic about the peacefulness of the process of change. There could be a lot of turmoil, which will cause a huge problem for everybody in this world. And you know, it's going to be a nightmare. So we all have to try and think of ways for the Chinese to realize a peaceful soft landing, not only economically but also politically. Economically, the slowdown is real. You know, no economy can keep on growing at that pace forever. And once the economic growth rate comes down, as it is now, employment immediately becomes a serious problem. Yes, innovation helps Chinese to grow, but with innovation, you need less people. So where are you going to create the employment opportunities? That is a very serious question that the Chinese are facing now. In the US, yes, there are many serious issues. The establishment must do something about the system too, but compared with the systemic change that the Chinese will go through, you know, in the US, you don't have to, I mean, they are not waiting for a revolution. They're just waiting for some societal change. Um, so I tend to think that the US will stay in Asia, partly because all the Asian nations except China wants the US out. Even North Korea wants the US because the North Koreans are very realistic. They don't trust China. So they don't want the American troops to go out of South Korea. Maybe the South Korean president wants the Americans out, but Kim Jong-un doesn't. It's a very interesting point. But anyhow, Americans will probably most likely going to stay. The Japanese will play a big role here because of the alliance. We think it's a public good in this part of the world that we have this alliance relationship with the US, which keeps the Americans here in East Asia. And I'd rather worry about the future of China, because we are very dependent on Chinese economic performance for our economic well-being now. We don't want China to collapse. We want soft landing, but we're not sure whether they can do it.
Very, very interesting, Professor. Yeah, there are many things that we could discuss later, but something that you said, yeah, it's very interesting. Many people think the legitimacy of the Communist Party of China is given by delivering high rates of economic growth, but as the economy slows down, that's become a problem. And the other that you also said, really, many people think that as China become richer, as a middle class arise, probably the oppressive political system could not sustain. They see an example of Korea, Taiwan, that were very authoritarian regime, but democracy came later because of Islam. So people think, rightly I said something like that we could expect from China later. Anyway, there are so many questions, Professor, that we can discuss. It's very late for Professor. Really, Professor, very, very thankful for you. It's already midnight in Japan. Really, we want to ask Professor for his kindness to be until late with us, but I want to compromise Professor Takahara for a next meeting. Perhaps there are many things that we can discuss. So, Professor, many, many thanks for your kind time for us, and I give you the floor for your final words.
I just want to say muchas gracias. Once the coronavirus is gone, please come to Japan. I very much look forward to meeting all of you in Tokyo. So
Thank
thank you very much.
Thank you,
Have a
Professor.
good day.
Yes. Ambassador Katayama also told us that he cannot be present in your conference. Who would have liked it? But we have very good relation with the Japanese embassy during the former stay of Ambassador Tsuchiya, which is thanks to him, 2 or 3 professors from Waseda, Keio came, and we hope also you could come to Peru to give us a conference in our university. Thanks, Professor. Thanks again. Thanks, everybody. It has been very nice to have here. Remember, this meeting has been recorded. You can see it anytime in our Facebook page. I will send you, Professor, the link, and also with the flyer that we should.
Gracias.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, friends, everybody, and take care, and see you again. Thanks again.
Adiós.
Adios, adios.